working in the health service now. The health service is performing more operations now, certainly than it was 17 years ago. And in particular, in the budget last week, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, was able to announce more than £6 billion extra on health spending, which will make the health service even stronger in the future than it is now.
Emily Thornberry.
I thank him for that response, but since he failed to answer my original question, I'll do it for him. According to the government's latest figures, more than 40% of newly recruited nurses are leaving full-time employment within their first year. And it is not just the new recruits that are quitting. The overall number of NHS nurses and health visitors is down by 1,500 this year. And the numbers are now lower than when this government came into office. So, why does the First Secretary think that so many nurses are leaving?
So he was wrong.
There are, as I say, more operations being done, more nurses, more doctors, more midwives. The health service is expanding. We have got 14,900 more doctors, 1,500 more medical school places each year. And we've got 10,000 more nurses on our wards, and we've announced an increase of more than 5,000 extra nurse training places every year. We are, of course, we have said, in addition, the Chancellor said in his budget that we would commit to make sure that the nurses' pay increase, the Action for Change cases, Agenda for Change, the Agenda for Change staffing covered would not come out of other health spending. So nurses can be reassured that this government will continue to support them both in pay and in terms of numbers, and that is why our health service in England is getting better. If she wants to look at a health service where things are getting worse, she can look to the Labour government in Wales. And she doesn't need to take it from me, she can take it from the public, because public satisfaction with the NHS in Wales is lower than it is in England. That's the effect of Labour government on healthcare.
I hate to break it to him, but there are more nurses in the NHS than just those who are working in emergency and acute wards, including district nurses. They have halved under the Tories. And guess who picks up the slack if nurses aren't there? It's nurses in emergency and acute care. But the question I ask, Mr. Speaker, is why so many nurses are leaving the vocation they love. Now, according to the RCN, the top 4 reasons are excess workload, staff shortages, low pay and worries about patient care. And according to the government's own figures, the number of nurses quitting because of worries about their finances or their health has doubled since the Tories first froze their pay. So let's get on to the question, with the question that was asked by John Prescott 17 years ago. He said that nurses at his local hospital were warning, and I quote him again, "Staff shortages are putting patients' lives at risk." So can he tell me, what are those same nurses telling the First Secretary today?
What I can tell you is that since 17 years ago, and it's interesting that 17 years ago there were still significant numbers of years of Labour government ahead with all these pressures she's just exposed to us under the Labour government. Since 17 years ago, there are significant more nurses in post, and I didn't quite understand her point about wards, because she seemed to go on and off the wards, but we know that we've got 10,000 more nurses on our wards where people want to see them. And also, if she's interested in nurses' pay, of course, I hope she will find it in herself to welcome the tax cuts that were announced in the budget, the increase in the personal allowances that will help nurses just as they will help workers across both the public and private sector. This is good news for nurses. It was a budget that was not just good for the health service, but specifically good for the nursing profession. As I say, I hope she can bring herself to welcome that.
Emily Thornberry.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I noticed that he didn't want to talk about patient care at his local hospital. Could the reason be that his local A&E, according to the board's most recent minutes, and I quote, have severe staff shortages in medical and nursing care, means patient safety is being put at risk, and the only option to tackle those shortages is to cancel outpatient clinics?
Oh!
And it gets worse. And it gets worse. At a public meeting tomorrow, there is going to be a public meeting tomorrow to consider closing his local A&E for good. In other words, all the things that the First Secretary has been denying. What are you doing to our NHS? It is happening on your own doorstep. Isn't it about time that the First Secretary got a grip?
I am entirely innocent in this matter. First Secretary.
The Right Honourable Lady's grasp of the facts is pretty shaky. The meeting tomorrow in my constituency is about the strategic transformation plan. I am happy to assure her that I am entirely in favour of option 1 of that strategic transformation plan, which suggests not just leaving A&E services in the hospital in my constituency, but actually expanding specialist services there. I would strongly suggest she doesn't try to think she knows more about what's going on in my constituency than I do.
I suspect that neither the nation nor his own constituents will have taken any reassurances from that answer. But really, Mr. Speaker, we have an NHS which is in the grip of a chronic funding and staffing crisis. GPs are quitting in record numbers, junior doctors are running A&Es without supervision, our nurses are at breaking point, and all this is before the winter crisis that is coming. So, Mr. Speaker, let me finally ask the First Secretary, what does it say about the government's priorities that last week's budget could only find £350 million to help the cash-strapped stretched to the limit NHS cope with the winter fuel crisis? Only £350 million to cope with the winter crisis, and was able to find 11 times that amount to spend on a no-deal Brexit. Isn't that the very definition of a government fiddling away whilst the rest of the country burns?
The Right Honourable Lady is determined to talk the NHS down. It's a Conservative government which is increasing funding on the NHS so it remains the best health service in the world, as the Independent Commonwealth Fund has repeated for the second year in a row. It's this party which promised and delivered more money for the NHS in 2010, 2015 and in last week's budget, where my right honourable friend the Chancellor promised £6.3 billion extra for the NHS. More patients treated, more operations carried out by more doctors and more nurses. And when she says at the end that the government is wasting £3 billion on preparing for Brexit, we now know that the Labour Party doesn't think it's worth preparing for Brexit. They do though think it's worth preparing for a run on the pound. That's all you need to know about Labour.
Mr. Speaker, this week, one of Labour's last 2 remaining councillors in Boston crossed the floor to join the Conservative Party. And he said he didn't want to see this country go back to 1973. Will the First Secretary join me in welcoming this new member to the Conservative Party? And will he agree with me that an open, optimistic Britain deserves better than reheated Marxism and Labour's bankrupt economy?
I am very happy to agree with my honourable friend, and indeed with the wisdom of the Labour councillor who has joined the Conservative Party. quite right that what we see from the party opposite is that they would lose control of public finances, hike taxes to their highest ever peacetime level, and calls business, the Shadow Chancellor, new quote I've discovered from the Shadow Chancellor, calls business the enemy. That's what the modern Labour Party is about. I would finally point out to the local councillor, he may just have moved in anticipation, because I understand that moderate councillors are being deselected by the hard left.
Ian Blackford. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the First Secretary in congratulating Prince Harry and Meghan on their engagement and wish them a long life and happiness together? And if I may, can I also welcome the moderator of the Church of Scotland, the Reverend Derek Browning, who is with us in the gallery today. Mr. Speaker, can the First Secretary of State tell the House how much money the UK government has received from arms sales from Saudi Arabia since the war with Yemen began?
Secretary.
I'm afraid I don't have the figure to hand, but I do urge the honourable gentleman to recognise the fact, first of all, that our defence industry is an extremely important creator of jobs and prosperity in Scotland as well as in other parts of the country, and that we have, because I'm obviously aware of the very terrible situation in Yemen at the moment. But this country has one of the most rigorous and robust defence sales regimes in the world. It was recognised in a court case last July, and we are absolutely determined to continue the most rigorous and robust system in place, because that's the right thing to do, both for our prosperity and to ensure we keep proper control on arms sales.
Well, that's a long time to be able not to answer the question, but I'll tell the First Secretary. The UK government has received £4.6 billion in selling arms to Saudi Arabia since the war in Yemen began. A war which has created a devastating humanitarian crisis. Yemen is now on the brink of famine, and UNICEF has said that 150,000 children will die by the end of this year. Doesn't the First Secretary agree that the best thing that the Prime Minister can do with our meetings today is follow the example of the Netherlands and suspend licences for arms sales to Saudi Arabia to stop killing children?
Secretary.
I should correct something the right honourable gentleman said, that the government received money. It will be the companies that receive the money, and therefore their workers. So he can take that position if he wants. It's I know the Labour Party's position as well, but that would certainly entail significant job losses. Now, what is very, very important is not only that we have the robust regime which I talked about, but that absolutely we continue the humanitarian efforts that we make to try and alleviate the terrible conditions in Yemen. We are the fourth largest humanitarian donor to Yemen and the second largest to the UN appeal. And I would also remind him that the involvement of the Saudis in this conflict came at a request of the legitimate government of Yemen and has United Nations Security Council backing. That's why we support it. This is a conflict supported by the UN Security Council, and I would hope that the right honourable gentleman will have some respect for the Security Council.
Rebecca Powell.
Speaker, this government's ambition to build more homes is welcome, especially amongst those struggling to get on the housing ladder. And Taunton Deane is playing its part, and with its garden town status, we must have homes that are good places to live, energy efficient, sustainable drainage, green spaces. Mr. Speaker, maybe even where we have showers where people don't use microbeads in their showers. But we must have the right roads in these developments, and would my right honourable friend agree that the Housing Infrastructure Fund is key to unlocking funds for vital roads like the Spine Road through Taunton and Stapleburn?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and I know what a stout champion she is of the people of Taunton Deane. And she's quite right about the Housing Infrastructure Fund as well. We need more homes, but absolutely we need the infrastructure to back them up. That's why the Chancellor doubled the Housing Infrastructure Fund in the budget.
Duffield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the First Secretary of State will know, being my near neighbour in Kent, as a result of underfunding, the Conservative County Council has run out of cash and is cutting the funding of buses in Kent by 70%. Four hospital buses, 14 school buses and over 100 other routes are to be cut. Thousands of pensioners, especially those in rural areas, are to be trapped at home. Does the Right Honourable Member for Ashford really support such cuts?
Secretary.
I do not recognise the characterisation of Kent County Council's position, which my constituency neighbour has expressed. All local authorities, as all parts of the public sector, have to live within their means because we have to continue paying down the deficit that was run up by the previous Labour government. Kent County Council is an extremely good county council which does many great things both in transport and other fields for the people of Kent and will continue to do so.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Would my right honourable friend agree that for decades now, the richer member states in the European Union have made large contributions to the budget of the EU because the macroeconomic benefits of belonging to the large free trade area of the single market make it a bargain to pay that share of the cost? Should we not therefore welcome the rumours we have today in the press of a possible imminent settlement of the method of calculating future contributions so that it may now enable us to get on with the serious negotiations about how we retain the maximum future access to all those benefits of that free trade?
Well,
Secretary.
My right honourable friend has been around long enough to know not necessarily to read, to believe everything he reads in the newspapers, and it would clearly be wrong for me to go into figures now. But he is absolutely right that what we are about, and what my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, is about, is making sure we get the best possible deal at this stage of the process so that we can move on to the trade talks. And Britain, as a country that meets its international obligations, of course, will, as it exits the European Union, meet the obligations and have all the rights that we have in that process so that we can maintain a deep and special partnership with the other 27 members of the European Union as we move forward in friendship and cooperation after we've left the European Union.
Being believed, reliving trauma, fear of publicity, a culture of denial, some of the reasons why very many women are reluctant to report rape, assault and sexual harassment. Does he agree with me that Government and Parliament need to lead by example, and will he, on behalf of Government, apologise to the victims who Parliament and Government have been letting down?
I absolutely agree that both this place as an institution and all of the political parties need to improve complaints procedures and other aspects of the culture of politics to make sure that young men or young women who are interested in politics do not in any way feel deterred from playing an active role in it. And there is a place for everyone in this House on all sides and in all parties, and indeed the House authorities themselves, of making sure that this is the best possible working environment for young people to come into.
Nadine Dorries.
Mr. Speaker, many mothers in this chamber know how hard childbirth can be, but we would never use that knowledge in a veiled threat against a journalist when being questioned in the way the Honourable Member for Hampstead and Kilburn did when questioned by a Channel 4 journalist recently. As I assume the First Secretary is not pregnant, would he please complete the work that journalist tried and ask the Honourable Member for Hampstead and Kilburn to use her influence with her aunt, who is the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, whose regime is responsible for the kidnapping of Ahmed bin Taseer, and ask for his release?
Very good question. First Secretary Price, I'm sure the Honourable Lady, the member for Mid-Bedfordshire, I'm sure the Honourable Member for Mid-Bedfordshire notified the Honourable Lady of an intention to refer to her in this question.
No, she didn't.
You didn't? Well, that was disorderly. Sorry, that was order. Nevertheless, the question has been asked. Nevertheless, perfectly proper for the First Secretary briefly to reply.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you and the House will be aware I can only speak on behalf of the government, and I can assure my honourable friend that Bangladesh remains an important human rights priority area for the Foreign Office, and that we continue to raise allegations of enforced disappearances at all levels of the government of Bangladesh. And I think I should stop there.
Steve McCabe. Mr. Speaker, at the present rate of progress, it will take the 3 officials at the First Secretary's old department more than 70 years to investigate the claims of around 4,500 WASPI women deprived of their state pension. Now, I know this government's slow, but isn't that adding insult to injury?
The Secretary.
The honourable gentleman will be aware that the government committed a sum of more than £1 billion to make sure that no one's pension would be delayed more than 18 months from the original period. And he also, I'm sure, as a reasonable man, recognises that with increasing longevity, it is inevitable that the pension age will rise. That is what this government is doing. And by next year, pension inequality will have been removed. We will hit 65 for both sexes in next year, and that means that we will then have an equal pension system.
James Gray.
The Royal Air Force is unique amongst the 3 services in having been established by an Act of Parliament which achieved royal assent 100 years ago today. Will my right honourable friend find time in his busy diary to join me and members of both houses and staff throughout the Palace in celebrating the magnificent service the RAF have given to this nation over that 100 years in a parade, a unique parade in the atrium of Portcullis House this evening at 7:30 by the Queen's Colour Squadron?
Well, as I've already mentioned the centenary today, and my honourable friend is extremely right not just to bring it up again. We cannot pay high enough tribute to the men and women of the RAF for a century of service that will go on for a long time into the future as well. And I'm glad he's managed to get an advert in for the parade this evening at Portcullis House.
Grady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The United Kingdom has lost its seat on the International Court of Justice. EU agencies are pulling out of London, and there'll be no more European capitals of culture in the United Kingdom. Is the sun setting on Empire 2.0 before it's even begun?
The Secretary.
I think the honourable gentleman it's not surprising, really, that EU institutions are not going to be in a state that's not a member of the EU. That can't come as a surprise to the honourable gentleman. On the capitals of culture, I rather agree with him. I think it's extremely disappointing that after they'd let British cities including, I know, some in Scotland, asking to apply to be part of the process, the Commission decided that they couldn't. We are in urgent talks with the Commission about that, and in particular, we're making sure that all those cities who applied can continue with their cultural development, because cultural development has been shown to be an extremely good basis for the regeneration of cities and towns across the United Kingdom.
Amanda Milling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This Saturday I'll be announcing the winners of my annual local shop competition as part of Small Business Saturday. So will my right honourable friend wish all Cannock Chase retailers the best of luck, and also wish those winners congratulations.
I'm very happy to share my honourable friend's congratulations for her retailers. I suspect many members will be celebrating Small Business Saturday this weekend. It's become an extremely important part of the calendar. Supporting small business is absolutely at the heart of this government's economic strategy, and we should all take every opportunity to celebrate the hugely important work they do in innovation, in entrepreneurship, and in serving the people.
Sarah Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, we see shocking new figures that child knife deaths are nearing a 40-year high. 5 months ago, the Prime Minister in this place promised action. but she has failed to deliver. Nothing in the budget on policing and nothing meaningful to tackle the causes as well as the crime. It's clear we need intervention now and not just from the Home Office. Funding youth workers in major trauma centres is proven to get young people out of the cycle of violence, and it would cost £6 million a year to fund. Will the First Secretary, in his role, establish a cross-government programme of action to come good on the Prime Minister's promise?
First Secretary. Well, I'm sure the Honourable Lady is aware that actually the stance on knife crime that this government is taking is tougher than ever. We've made punishment against repeat offenders stronger. We've banned cautions for the most serious offences, and there is now a very clear message. If you carry knives in public, you are more likely than ever to go to prison. And the latest figures show that 42% of adult offenders were given an immediate custodial sentence, the highest rate in nearly a decade. So I hope that she can be reassured that actually this government is being tougher on knife crime than any previous government.
Nadeem Zahawi.
Speaker, does the First Secretary agree with me that we don't need to break into the computer or the iPad of the member for Hayes and Harlington to work out that £500 billion that he wants to borrow will attract £7.5 billion of interest payments every year?
Well, the one difficulty with that otherwise ingenious question is that it bears no relation to government policy, for which the right honourable gentleman is responsible, but rather to that of the Shadow Chancellor, for which he isn't. Wayne David.
Mr. Speaker, Sharon Jones is a constituent who had a malignant brain tumour removed some 20 years ago. This left her with excruciating headaches and severe pain in her neck and shoulders. Sharon has been in receipt of ESA, and the Department for Work and Pensions accepts that Sharon is not fit for work, and yet she has now been placed in the work-related activity group and her benefit has been reduced. Will the First Secretary justify this to Sharon?
Wow. First Secretary.
Well, obviously, there will clearly be individual issues in this case, which I can't be aware of. I'm sure my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, would be very happy to look at this individual case to see if something needs to be done for Sharon.
John Stevenson.
Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the announcement of a Borderlands growth deal. This is positive news for the border area. But can the First Secretary assure me that this initiative will receive sufficient resource to ensure its success?
The Secretary.
I share my honourable friend's enthusiasm for the Borderlands Growth Initiative. I've seen the many benefits of city deals and growth deals around all parts of the United Kingdom since I became First Secretary, and I think the Borderlands Growth Initiative is particularly important because it will show the mutual prosperity between his part of the north of England and the southern part of Scotland. And all I can say is that since my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Scotland, is actually a constituency MP in the southern part of Scotland, I know that this deal will get particularly strict attention inside the Cabinet.
Tommy Shepherd.
Does the First Secretary agree with the Lord Speaker's Committee that the House of Lords should be reduced to 600 and that the term should be limited to 15 years? And does he not feel the slightest sense of embarrassment that the crisis of credibility of the undemocratic upper chamber has become so acute that its members are themselves begging for reform whilst the elected government refuses to act?
Yes, I think when the honourable gentleman speaks on behalf of all members of the House of Lords in terms of begging for reform, he may not necessarily absolutely be representing the entire range of views in another place, but I'm happy to assure him that the government is looking very carefully at the proposal of the Burns Committee, and we will of course respond in due course.
Damien Collins.
Speaker. Could my honourable friend and neighbour say what action the government is proposing to take against Russian-backed agencies spreading fake news and disinformation? We know they've been doing it in our political campaigns, but also worrying reports as well that disinformation may be spread around important issues like accessing vaccines and the flu jab.
The Secretary.
My honourable friend is quite right to raise this. Cybersecurity is an extremely important issue, and fake news and the dissemination of potentially dangerous information is one part of that. So the National Cybersecurity Centre is looking very hard at this. It takes a number of measures to combat it, some of which obviously have to remain private, but I can absolutely assure him it is very high on the agenda of the National Cyber Security Centre, which is just over a year old and which is doing very good work in ensuring that the whole area of cybersecurity is much better than it used to be.
Streeting. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. An 11-year-old primary school pupil approached me to tell me that he, his mother and his 2 brothers live in a single room in a bedsit in Ilford, and could I find him a council flat like the one that I grew up in? What's heartbreaking about that is that I know, and the First Secretary will know, that it's very unlikely that he will ever have one. So can I ask him very simply, given that the measures announced in last week's so-called housing budget will not solve the scale of the problem that sees more than 100,000 children living in temporary accommodation, what is he going to do to make sure that that boy, his family and every other child living in a bedsit or temporary bed and breakfast accommodation gets the decent home that they need, that they can call their own?
I absolutely agree that this is a serious problem, and that's one of the reasons why housing was at the centre of my right honourable friend, the Chancellor's budget. I hear from the opposition front bench that the right honourable lady has recovered her voice now and is asking what we're doing about it. I'll tell her what we're doing about it. Last year, we delivered more homes than we've seen in all but one of the last 30 years. 217,000, taking us to 1.1 million since 2010. Over the next 5 years, we will invest £44 billion in home building, boosting the funding for council, social and low-cost housing to over £9 billion. We are building more social housing than the Labour government did in its 13 years in office. We will build even more in the future. This is a government that's addressing his constituents' problems. Previous Labour governments signally failed to do so.
Alex Chalk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the recent extremely successful Cheltenham Literature Festival, Hillary Clinton came and talked about the importance of ensuring that the Russians are not allowed to meddle in British elections or indeed in American elections. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that we should be building an offensive cyber capability so that our opponents know we have the will but also the wherewithal to strike back?
My honourable friend is exactly right, as you would expect from the Member of Parliament who represents GCHQ. And he is absolutely right about the offensive capacity that we may well need in the cyber area, and I'm happy to assure him and the House that we are indeed developing that.
Mary Black.
Yeah. I would like to ask the Minister if, without mentioning the new state pension, apprenticeships, or stating the falsehood that the Scottish Government can somehow fix the problem, and given that the Prime Minister is a waspy woman herself, how he can justify a rise of 413% in the number of women over the age of 60 in receipt of ESA because of this government's refusal to give them their pensions?
Well, as I replied to a previous question on this subject, I hope she would recognise the principle that is right, that we need, as we live longer, to move up the pension age. And she knows as well as I do that actually the Scottish Government does have the capacity to top up welfare payments. They like to sit here and deny this, but in Holyrood they know they could do this. So, as ever with the SNP, they should stop simply moaning in this chamber. They should go back to their own government in Scotland and say if they want to do something, they should do it. They should get on with the day job of running Scotland.
Wendy Morton.
I very much welcome the government's modern industrial strategy that was launched this week. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that it's really going to be important as this country moves forward? We seek a global Britain in creating more and better quality jobs.
My honourable friend is exactly right. The point about the industrial strategy, which is a hugely important moment, is to create not just a stronger economy, but a fairer economy for decades to come. That's why it's looking forward to 2030. It's a long-term attempt to make sure that we have not just a global outward-looking economy, which I completely agree on, but a modern economy where we can capitalise on our huge research strengths and our huge intellectual strengths to make sure that, unlike as so often in the past, we actually benefit commercially from that for decades to come. That's the route to rising productivity and rising prosperity.
Cordova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This Sunday, the 3rd of December, is the UN International Day of Persons with a Disability. So far, this government has refused to carry out a cumulative impact assessment of its social security policies on people living with a disability. Will the First Secretary now mark this day by doing the right thing for disabled people and carry out a full cumulative impact assessment?
The Secretary.
Well, I'm sure the Honourable Lady, who has great expertise in this field, will know that this government is spending £90 billion on disability benefits. But more to the point, we are being more successful than ever before in giving disabled people a degree of independence. Hundreds of thousands more disabled people are in work than have ever been before. We have a plan to have an extra million in work over the next 10 years. That is an extremely important and practical way to improve the lives of hundreds of thousands of disabled people. That's what this government is doing, and that's what we'll continue to do.
Richard Bacon.
Mr. Speaker, given that President Rouhani of Iran has said Iran will not be the first country to breach the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, can the First Secretary assure us that British diplomats are working hard in Washington, D.C. to persuade our American friends that it is in the interests of the West and of Iran to uphold the JCPOA as an essential prelude to solving other regional problems?
The Secretary.
My honourable friend is right. We think that the JCPOA is a very important part of attempting to improve conditions not just between Iran and its neighbours but across the wider Middle East, and we will continue to argue that case in all parts of the world.
Mr. Nigel Dodds.
Speaker, and I too join in offering congratulations to Prince Harry and Meghan Markle on their engagement. And one of the issues that Prince Harry has rightly highlighted and campaigned on is the issue of mental health. And the Invest for Life campaign in Northern Ireland is doing a fantastic job in highlighting the need for extra resources on that issue. And we join in that campaign and have secured extra resources. But at a time when issues like that, mental health, education and all the rest of it, need to be prioritised in Northern Ireland by a locally devolved government working on these issues and representing the people of Northern Ireland, does the First Secretary of State agree that it is a gross dereliction of responsibility for Sinn Féin to announce this week that they are not going to engage in further discussions on the restoration of devolution? And if that's the case, then we now need to move quickly to restore accountability and ministers to the Northern Ireland office to get on with the people's business of responsible government in Northern Ireland.
Well, the right honourable gentleman will know that my right honourable friend, the Northern Ireland Secretary, is working as hard as possible to restore democratic control, to restore the Northern Ireland Executive. We all want to see proper devolved government restored in Northern Ireland. I think that would be by far the best thing for the people of Northern Ireland, and this government will continue to work tirelessly to that end.
Order. Yes, exceptionally I will take the point of order now. If members who are leaving the chamber would be good enough to do so quickly and quietly, it's quite unaccountable if they don't wish to hear the honourable gentleman, member for Cardiff South and Penarth, but there's no accounting for taste. And that would all greatly avail us. Point of order, Mr. Stephen Doughty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and for exceptionally taking this. You may not be aware, Mr. Speaker, nor others in the House, but it appears that the President of the United States has, in recent moments, been retweeting comments from a far-right organisation, Britain First, highly inflammatory videos, including some posted by an individual who I believe has recently been arrested and charged relating to certain serious offences. And I wondered whether you had noticed, Mr. Speaker, of any intended statement by the Home Secretary or the Foreign Secretary on this very serious matter.
Absolutely. I confess I have no advance notice of this matter. I am not myself one who tends to follow what is said on Twitter, though the honourable gentleman is almost invariably very well informed on these matters. But the Home Secretary is in her place, and if she wants to say anything, she's welcome to do so, but she's under absolutely no obligation to do so whatsoever. But the Right Honourable Lady is not hailing a taxi. Oh, very well. In deference to the seniority of the Right Honourable Lady in the House. If she's got a point of order to raise, of course I'll hear it.
Further to that point of order, Mr. Speaker, I understand that the woman in question has indeed already been convicted of hate crime in this country. And on that basis, given the significance and the seriousness of having the President of the United States giving her such a huge platform, does he not think it would be appropriate for us to hear some word of condemnation and raising this from the Home Secretary or the Foreign Secretary?
It's not Katie Hopkins yet. Well, it's a point of order for the Chair, and I can say only to the Right Honourable Lady that at the moment, as it will be very obvious to her and to her honourable friend, I've received no advance notice of any intention to make a statement, and it would be it would be wrong to expect a government minister immediately to respond. The Home Secretary, to be fair, is under no obligation to do so. What I would say is that I do know the honourable gentleman for Cardiff South and Penarth now very well, and if anything, I know the Right Honourable Lady, because we came into the House together 20 years ago, even better. And knowing them as well as I do, I know that when they've got their teeth into something, they are disinclined to let go. And by the way, that's a compliment. So I think we'll leave it there for now, but I rather imagine this matter will probably be mentioned again. But if there are no further points of order, we come now to the urgent question. Mr. Chris Leslie.
Mr. Speaker, may I ask the Chancellor of the Exchequer?
It would be completely wrong of me to cut across those discussions by commenting on speculation on the financial settlement, and it would not be in our national interest. The Prime Minister made it clear in her Florence speech that EU member states would not need to pay more or receive less money over the remainder of the current budget as a result of our decision to leave. She also made it clear that the UK will honour its commitments made during the period of membership in the spirit of our future partnership. As we have said before, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, and that any settlement that we make is contingent upon us securing a suitable outcome, as outlined by the Prime Minister in her Florence speech. And we will meet our commitments and also get a good deal for the UK taxpayer. We want to see progress towards our preferred option, which is an implementation period followed by an ambitious future economic partnership. In the budget, we set aside £3 billion in addition to the £700 million we've already allocated to make sure that our country is fully prepared for all eventualities. What we've seen today is simply media speculation, and we will update the House when there is more detail to give.
Mr. Chris Leslie.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the British people were promised a dividend from Brexit. They were told that leaving the EU was going to save us a fortune, and those who campaigned for Brexit daubed their hubris across the side of a giant red bus, promising a windfall of £350 million for the NHS per week. That wasn't just a whopping lie, it was the direct opposite of the truth. Exactly. So, Mr. Speaker, will the Chief Secretary confirm that if the divorce bill comes in somewhere, as is speculated, between £40 billion and £67 billion, that could be a payment of £1,000 from every man, woman and child in this country? £1,000. And isn't this speculated divorce bill just the tip of the iceberg? If we're being honest about the true costs of Brexit, shouldn't we also add in the lost revenues to the Exchequer in the Red Book, something of the order of £20 billion by 2021? Add in also that £3.7 billion of Brexit preparations for all those duplicated agencies, new border arrangements, the lorry parks in Dover and so forth, and of course add in the higher cost of living for all of our constituents as prices keep on rising. Can I ask the Chief Secretary, how do her constituents react to the idea that they're going to be lumbered with all these extra costs? Don't they ask her, what exactly are we getting for this? What wondrous new advantages will we gain by shelling out these astronomical sums? Won't the Chief Secretary be straight with the House that we are paying for the privilege of putting the world's most efficient, free trade, tariff-free, frictionless agreement into the bin, and we are being told to pay for the privilege of downgrading to an inferior deal with our European neighbours? Why is the Chief Secretary being so coy about the deal that is being done? They've gone from go whistle to where do we sign? In a week where the government still won't fully publish the Brexit impact assessment papers to this House, we're now hearing rumours, Mr. Speaker, that Parliament and the public may never be told the full amount. When will Parliament be told what is actually happening, and will we get a vote on the sums of money involved? Will she, right here and right now, scotch this nonsense that the true costs of Brexit will be hidden away in a convenient backroom deal in the negotiations? Mr. Speaker, the British people need to know, is there a deal? How much have the government put on the table in the negotiations? And if she won't tell us, why does she think that the only people who can't be told are the British public and the British Parliament? This is not what the British public voted for in the referendum. It is not taking back control, it is losing control.
Well, I can tell the honourable gentleman what my constituents say. What they say is the country has voted to leave the European Union, and what they want to see is us get on with it and secure the best possible deal for Britain. And if we look at the opposition benches, we see people like the honourable gentleman who's asked the question, who's voted to stay in the single market and the customs union. We see members of the front bench who voted to leave the single market and the customs union. Today we read that the Shadow Home Secretary wants there to be a second referendum. This is not remotely helpful in securing the best possible deal. And the honourable gentleman knows perfectly well we are in negotiations as we speak. If in this House we were to talk about numbers and we were to talk about the aspects of the deal, that would cut across our negotiating position. What the people of Britain want to see is they want to see us get on with it. They want to see us take the advantages of leaving the European Union, make the most of those opportunities, secure the best possible deal. We're well on the way to doing that. And I suggest the honourable gentleman that rather than trying to refight the referendum battle, which is exactly what he seems to be doing, he needs to get with the programme and start talking about how he can be helpful.
Mr. Kenneth Clark. Mr. Speaker, would my right honourable friend agree that no government of any EU member state could possibly be expected to agree that we should have a good future trading and economic relationship with the Union, whilst at the same time we repudiate all our past financial obligations and are somehow refusing to pay a fair share of the costs of agencies and so on that we will incur in the future? Would she therefore agree that those who oppose paying any money are presumably wanting a no-deal Brexit? And that would actually be catastrophic for this country and would stop the opportunity my right honourable friend, the Brexit Secretary, has of negotiating a deal that retains as many benefits for jobs, investment and the growth of the economy of this country as we possibly can in the future.
Well, as the Prime Minister laid out in her Florence speech, we do want to abide by our commitments made during our period of membership, and we also want to see progress on securing a deal. And the right honourable gentleman is right. Any settlement that we seek to achieve has to be contingent on getting a suitable outcome from those negotiations as outlined by the Prime Minister, because what we want to make sure is any money spent is value for money for the British taxpayer.
Jonathan Reynolds. Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend from Nottingham East for raising this critical question today. As we all know, settling this issue is vital to continuing to the next part of the negotiations. Given that progress has been so much slower than we would have hoped, the opposition is supportive of efforts to resolve this part of the negotiations as soon as is feasible, so we can start to make progress to end the uncertainty which is impacting on jobs and the economy. We believe the financial settlement with the EU must meet our international obligations while delivering a fair deal for British taxpayers. The UK is a responsible country and there is no mileage in us refusing to meet our obligations. And if we are going to negotiate the comprehensive new trade agreement with the European Union, which we need for future jobs and prosperity, we do need to be seen as a country which can be trusted to comply with the deals we reach. Given our long-standing membership of the European Union, this calculation will understandably be complex. We appreciate the government cannot announce a figure publicly at this stage, given it is a sensitive part of the negotiations. But what we would argue for instead is that the government must be transparent about the process, especially once an understanding has been reached with our EU partners. This is why we've tabled an amendment to the withdrawal bill, which calls for any financial settlement to be assessed by the Office for Budget Responsibility, by the National Audit Office, and for Parliament to have the chance to scrutinise it. The government's handling of the presentation of the impact assessment studies to Parliament has left a lot to be desired. So can I therefore ask the Chief Secretary to promise that the government will support that amendment in the interests of transparency and of clarity? Secretary.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his supportive comments, and I'm glad he agrees with the government's strategy. I think the next step will be making sure his backbench colleagues also agree with his strategy. And he's absolutely right that we should not reveal the details of negotiations while they are ongoing. But I would point out to the honourable gentleman that the approach of the opposition of saying that any deal is better than no deal is not the best way of securing a deal. And that is why, whilst our preferred option is an implementation period followed by a strong agreement following that, we also are preparing for all eventualities. That's why we're preparing, that's why we're putting in £3 billion. And I would suggest that the opposition should also support that very responsible approach.
Ian Duncan-Smith.
Speaker, can I say to my right honourable friend that I am not in favour of anything that is not legal, and so I support her completely, and I'm in line with my right honourable learned friend who got up earlier, that whatever the legal agreement is bound against the contingency of a free trade arrangement is exactly what the government set out to do. And could she please remind those who have raised this question that even if we agreed a figure of something in the order of 40 billion over 40 years, because we will not be paying contributions to the European Union, that means the UK Exchequer will be better off by £360 million in the course of that 40 years, a net gain with a free trade arrangement.
Well, my right honourable friend makes a very fair point. Whatever happens, we are not going to be paying anything like what we would have paid as an EU member, and that represents a considerable saving to the British taxpayer.
Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member from Nottingham East for bringing this matter to the House. Mr. Speaker, there would be no newspaper rumours about the sum if the government actually told us what the sum was. Nobody voted for this disastrous, disorganised EU exit. People voted for £350 million a week for the NHS, not to spend £40 or £50 billion just to be worse off. Mr. Speaker, our public services must not pay the price for this Brexit mess. It surprised us all when earlier this year the Prime Minister found a magic money tree. Surely the government can't have been lucky enough to find two. Will the Chancellor, given that there was a budget last week which did not make provision for this 40 or 50 billion pounds, will he now bring forward an emergency budget to explain where he is finding the money?
Well, I thought, Mr. Speaker, when the Honourable Lady stood up, it was going to be to thank the government for the £2 billion additional spending power that we gave to the Scottish Government in the budget, which no doubt they'll be able to use to improve their public services. As I've said before, and indeed has been pointed out by the opposition front bench, to talk about the money now would cut across the negotiations and prevent us from getting the best possible deal, and that is not in anyone's interests.
John Redwood.
Glad the government has confirmed today that it's carrying on with comprehensive preparations for no deal, because it is very important we are not up against the clock at the end, forced into a bad deal because we have no alternative. And will she confirm that no deal has the great advantage of no payments whatsoever under the divorce bill heading, so when the government recommends a deal, it has to be visibly better?
Well, my honourable friend is correct, and it is irresponsible of the opposition front bench to suggest that any deal is better than no deal. That is the way that we are not going to get our preferred option, which is an implementation period plus our preferred economic partnership. And that is why we are allocating £3 billion to make sure we're prepared for all eventualities.
Hilary Benn.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. The United Kingdom is currently a member of a very large number of EU agencies, from that dealing with aviation safety to the European Medicines Agency. Has the government made an assessment of the likely cost to the Exchequer of having to replicate all of those functions and activities if the government eventually decides that we have to leave all of them because of its stated principled objection to the ECJ having any jurisdiction over the United Kingdom?
Well, I've been very clear with the House already that we are preparing for all eventualities, and of course looking at the specifics of those agencies is part of that.
Mr. David Jones.
As my right honourable friend has pointed out, in her Florence speech, the Prime Minister made a very fair and generous offer to the European Union. Does my right honourable friend not agree that, given that Article 50 of the treaty provides that the negotiations that are currently underway should be conducted taking into account the future relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union, it is high time that the European Union reciprocated and started adhering to its obligations under the treaty?
Well, as my honourable friend points out, it is important that we move on to the next stage of the negotiations and talk about our long-term relationship with the European Union once we've left, and that's exactly what we are seeking to do.
Yvette Cooper.
The Chief Secretary's answer is that all of our constituents saw the slogan on the side of a bus, and if the government simply says nothing and keeps radio silence for a long time and then suddenly plucks a figure out of a hat at the end of the process, then it will just be incomprehensible to everyone. So surely she can tell the House what are the kinds of things that the government thinks that it should be funding, be that pension contributions or whatever else. Surely she can tell us the kinds of things rather than just leaving everybody in the dark. What's the formula?
Well, I refer the Honourable Lady to the Prime Minister's Florence speech, where she laid out our commitments that we want to continue and honour after we've left the European Union in the spirit of our future partnership. But the Honourable Lady has to be aware, the Right Honourable Lady has to be aware, that this is part of a discussion which is also about our future relationship. And all of those elements are contingent on securing our future relationship, as the Prime Minister laid out in the Florence speech. So it would be wrong at this stage, both from the point of view of the negotiations, but also the point of view of transparency to the public, to lay out something before it's fully agreed. That would not be helpful.
Sir Ren Patterson.
Cheer up the miseries on the far side of the chamber. Perhaps I would like to look at the prospective budget put out by Economists for Free Trade the week before the budget, with a really exciting prospectus that our economy will grow at 3% a year by 2025, providing an infrastructure surplus of £60 billion, which easily covers the 18.2 for the famous 350 million. But it's contingent on reciprocal free trade with zero tariffs. So will my right honourable friend guarantee that there will be no legally binding commitment to spend money until our partners do agree to a serious free trade deal based on reciprocal free trade and zero tariffs?
Well, I fear my honourable friend is over-optimistic if he thinks we can stop the opposition benches being miserable. We've tried this for 4 days of budget debate and have been so far unsuccessful. But my honourable friend is absolutely right to talk about the benefits of free trade for the British economy. I completely agree with him. And we are seeking a good deal that benefits the UK in the long term.
Tom Brake.
Mr. Speaker, at least £45 billion, higher inflation and debt, an extra year of cuts and less influence in the world is the price the government are willing to pay for a deluded vision of Great Britain post-Brexit. Is there any level of damage the UK economy, jobs and families have to sustain which will cause the government to rethink, give the people a vote on the deal, supported by the Liberal Democrats, Sadiq Khan, the London Mayor, and, as I understand it now, the Shadow Home Secretary?
I see, regrettably, that the misery has spread to the Liberal Democrat benches. There seems to be a contagion issue on the benches opposite. I would just invite the honourable gentleman to welcome the fact that we have the lowest unemployment in this country that we've had for 40 years, that we have the third highest number of start-ups in the world, a record number for this country, and the positive benefits that we're seeing from the actions of this Conservative government.
John Barron.
To the Minister, that most of us, certainly on these benches, accept that a good trade deal is better than no deal, that there is always give and take in a negotiation. It is important that we meet our financial commitments. But does the Minister also accept that this is largely, this issue, a storm in the teacup, because nothing is agreed until everything is agreed? It's important to make that point and not listen to the siren voices the few siren voices who still refuse to accept the result of the referendum.
Well, my honourable friend is right. Regrettably, there are people, particularly on the opposition benches, who still don't seem to accept democracy and the fact that people did vote to leave the European Union.
Chris Bryant.
The thing is, the government is keeping its cards so close to its chest that I suspect they've not even looked at them themselves. and for that matter, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is saying, because the government minister is obviously making it clear that we are going to pay lots of money for a no-deal outcome. And yet, the Foreign Secretary boldly told this House quite confidently, that our foreign counterparts could go whistle. What was he suggesting that they should whistle? Stand and deliver your money or your life.
Sounded great in practice.
Well, the honourable gentleman will be aware that considerable work is taking place across government, but it would be wrong to cut across our negotiators in the deal that they are seeking to strike. And it's in our country's interest to reach the point where we are talking about our long-term economic relationship with the European Union.
Sir Desmond Swain.
She shouldn't pay more than we owe, Mr. Speaker, but she should be confident that whatever that is, it's a bargain against the cost of staying in.
Well, my honourable friend makes a good point that, as we stay in, were we to stay in, the cost would be considerably higher than any amount we're talking about as part of our negotiations.
Mrs. Louise Ellman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government is so intent on keeping information it has about Brexit secretive, it's actually risking contempt of Parliament. So as this even more secretive financial settlement is negotiated, how can we be sure that it really represents the national interest?
As I have pointed out already in this discussion that we're having, These negotiations are not yet complete. There is not a number that we can disclose to the House, and absolutely, when there is one and when there is more detail to give, we will come to the House and talk about it.
Mr. Robert Halfon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my honourable friend agree that following a good budget and the need for good housekeeping and the pressures on public spending, that if the impression is given that we have wads of cash and loads of money when it comes to Europe, that it undermines our arguments on the public sector and on the need for good housekeeping, especially since the House of Lords says we have no legal or financial obligations? And does she not also agree that this is not a divorce bill? We are leaving a club, and once you leave a club, you no longer have to pay subscriptions.
Well, first of all, we were able to make sure we stuck within our fiscal rules at the budget, making sure that debt is falling as a proportion of GDP for the first time in 13 years, and keeping within our deficit targets as well. Whilst at the same time we were able to freeze fuel duty to help ordinary working people who need to keep their living costs down. So we were able to do all of those things. The reality is that as we leave the European Union, we will no longer be paying those vast sums of money in, and that will represent a benefit to the taxpayer.
Ms. Skinner.
Is the Minister aware that 70% of the people that voted in Bolsover voted to leave? Yes. But can I also say this to you? Those same people in Bolsover, I believe, would expect me to tell the Honourable Lady from the Finance Department that if they've got £60 billion to spare, it should go to the National Health Service and social care.
Well, the honourable gentleman will be well aware that as part of last week's budget, we were able to put additional money into the National Health Service, into hospital capital, into making sure that we hit our A&E targets, and we're also allocating money to help with nurses' pay too. So the honourable gentleman, I no doubt, will be pleased about that.
Okay. Dr. Julian Lewis.
These negotiations remind me of the even more complex ones on arms reductions in the 1980s. And will the Minister bear in mind that the lessons of those negotiations were, first, that too many one-sided concessions project an image of weakness, and secondly, in order to get the very best deal, you often have to walk away first and wait for the other side to agree with you to sit down, come back and negotiate realistically.
Very good point.
Well, it's because we need to make sure that the European Union are aware we have alternatives, that we are preparing, as well as for our preferred option of a transition period plus a long-term economic agreement, we're also preparing for a no-deal scenario. And the opposition want to give that option away, so we wouldn't be able to have that discussion with the European Union.
Pat McFadden.
There are two salient features about the news that is emerging. The first is, this is the opposite to what was promised during the referendum. We were promised 350 million a week more, and now the government is set to pay up to 50 billion when our constituents urgently need money for health, housing, policing and much more. But secondly, what is it that we are paying for? Other countries pay significant sums to get into the single market. We are lining up to pay up to £50 billion to leave the single market. Isn't the tragedy that these huge sums are going to pay for a worse deal than we have at present? And that's hardly strategic genius.
Well, it's absolutely right that the UK honours its commitments in the spirit of our future partnership. But as I've said before, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, and we will expect to make progress and secure that long-term economic partnership, which will be to the benefit of UK citizens.
Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will my right honourable friend note the growing concern that Her Majesty's government seems in these negotiations to be dancing to the tune of the European Commission? And can I ask her further to the question from my right honourable friend, the member for North Shropshire, if she can be certain that after the 29th of March 2019, that we will make no payments to the European Union whatsoever in the absence of a full agreement covering trade?
Well, I can assure my honourable friend that we are not dancing to anyone's tune. What we care about is the future of Britain's economy, protecting the British taxpayer from excess payments and making sure that we secure a good deal, which is why it's so important that we don't discuss these numbers whilst we're in the middle of a very important negotiation.
Jonathan Edwards.
Mr. Speaker, I have been informed by a former public finances auditor that International Accounting Standard 37 on provisions, contingent liabilities and contingent assets requires the UK Government to account for the divorce payment in its public finances as expenditure, even if the exact amount cannot be calculated. Given that the Government's accounts for 2016-17 did not adequately disclose the potential liability as required by IAS 37, will she give assurances that a liability of this magnitude will now be included in the supplementary estimates for 2017-18 and that this provision will be subject to a vote of this House?
Well, that would be wrong according to accounting principles because nothing has been agreed, and the Office of Budget Responsibility followed the Prime Minister's Florence speech in laying out their projections for the budget. I suggest to the honourable gentleman that he's misinterpreted those standards.
Mr. Philip Davis.
Can my right honourable friend confirm that she does agree with me that the UK should pay the EU what we are legally obliged to pay, not a penny more and not a penny less? And if so, will she make sure that before this House votes on the final bill, we have an itemised account of exactly what we are paying for at the end of it, and also the legal basis upon which we are making those payments? Because I have to say, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member for Bolsover is absolutely right. If there's any spare money going at a time of austerity, that should be directed to our priorities in the UK. It should not be giving a bung to the European Union that we're not legally obliged to do.
I can assure my honourable friend that we are determined to get the best possible deal for the British taxpayer, and we need to look at the overall deal in the round and see what represents value for money. And absolutely, the money should be being spent on our public services and also keeping taxes low for our hard-working citizens.
Mrs. Helen Goodman.
Speaker, last week the Treasury published the Red Book, and this showed that there would be no more payments to EU institutions from 2019. And the Red Book also said there was 15 billion of headroom and then debt would be falling. Doesn't the news overnight show there's a 30 billion hole in the public finances and there is no possibility of debt falling on this time scale?
Well, the Honourable Lady is not correct about that. The OBR have made predictions on EU payments, and those are included in the budget. In fact, it was raised by my honourable friend at the budget debate last week.
Jonathan Ginogly.
Could the Minister please confirm that any payments that are to be offered will be itemised and set out so that Parliament can understand what the constitution of the payment is going to be, and that we can therefore put it into the context of any likely conditioning that may be required in the context of any future relationship deal?
I can assure my honourable friend that the payments that would potentially be made, and as we've discussed before, nothing is agreed until everything agreed, will be absolutely value for money.
Stephen Timms.
That's not what he asked.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend is absolutely right in his question to highlight the very serious difficulties the country now faces. I hope it's true that agreement has been reached on the cost of exit so that the negotiations can move on to the next stage. Does the Right Honourable Lady agree with me? It is absolutely essential in the UK national interest that the European Council at its meeting next month agrees that enough progress has been made to move on to discussions about future trade?
We absolutely want to secure moving on to the next stage of these negotiations. That is very important. Ultimately, it takes the UK and the EU 27 to agree on that. And what would be wrong is to take the approach of the opposition and say we will agree to any deal regardless of what it is. We have to look at all eventualities and make sure we're prepared for all eventualities.
Shailesh Vara.
Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree with me that the message for the doommongers is that the British public have given their verdict and they expect Parliament to deliver? And that the doommongers should recognise that we are the 5th strongest economy in the world, that our population is significantly more than 15 EU countries put together, and it's high time they started talking up Britain rather than talking us down.
Well, my honourable friend is right. The opposition benches refuse to see any of the positive things that are happening in our country, whether it's the lowest youth unemployment for over 13 years, whether it's the highest number of new start-ups this country has ever seen. There are great things happening, and let's see a bit more optimism on the opposition.
Rian Austin.
Mr. Speaker, people in the Black Country voted to leave, but they were never at any point told that it could cost them £1 billion a week. And they certainly weren't told that it could make them worse off. Now, if it is the case, as we've been told, that they will be much better off as a result of this, and that there will, as the Right Honourable Lady promised a moment ago, be considerable savings, will she promise that those savings will be used to replace those programmes currently funded by the EU, like, for example, the crucial £50 million a year skills programme that's operating in the Black Country?
Well, there will be savings once we leave the European Union. I've already made that clear, and we want to make sure that they're spent in the best interests of everybody in the UK to make our country as successful as it can possibly be.
Sir Henry Bellingham.
Speaker, the Chief Secretary will be very aware that both her constituents and mine voted overwhelmingly to leave. But does she also agree, and does she feel on the ground, that most people now want to get on with Brexit, but also expect the UK to be fair, generous and magnanimous, so long as the financial settlement is contingent on a free trade deal?
Very good. Well, as my honourable friend points out, the people of Norfolk are fair-minded people. They want to see the referendum result respected. They want to see us honour our commitments to the European Union, but they want to see it in such a way that is fair for Britain, fair for British taxpayers, and make sure that we get the best possible deal.
Mr. Stephen Doughty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These figures are astronomical, but is it not the case that the British public are already paying for the costs of this government's Brexit approach in the form of the £3 billion that the Chancellor announced in the budget that's going to have to be spent on Brexit contingencies, and the over £700 million that he's already shelled out? Shouldn't people have been told that before the referendum?
I do think it's completely irresponsible of the opposition to suggest that we should not prepare for all eventualities. It would be disgraceful for the government not to do that. It would not be the proper action of a responsible government.
Mr. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the first time in my parliamentary career, I'm going to agree with the honourable member for Bolsover. He is absolutely right. The 60-odd% of the people in Wellingborough who voted to leave would want to know what we were doing with £60 billion. They'd want it spent on the NHS, social care and defence. They would not want it given to the European Union. Would the Minister agree such a move would be betraying the trust of the British people?
The money that we've been reading about in the press is speculation. These negotiations are ongoing, the discussion is ongoing, and we want to secure value for money for the British taxpayer. It's in our interests to secure a long-term economic partnership with the European Union, but we will not be paying over money until everything is agreed.
Drew Hendry.
Mr. Speaker, at page 25 of the Government's brand new industrial strategy document, it states that the Government are seeking a an implementation period of around 2 years. Does this reported deal include provision for paying for an extended deal beyond 2 years?
These negotiations are taking place at the moment. We want to secure a reasonable transition deal, but we have to know what the future relationship is going to be like before we enter into that transition deal, because the British public would not accept the can being kicked down the road. They want to know we're leaving the European Union.
Mr. Richard Graham.
Mr. Speaker, the greatest risk to the new partnership that both the UK and the EU want is that the EU makes such unreasonable demands that no British government could accept, on the wrong assumption that this House will never vote for no deal. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that all members who want a good deal, like the members for Nottingham East, Dudley North, Wolverhampton South East and Cardiff South, should make it absolutely clear to their constituents that they do not subscribe to the ludicrous idea that any deal is better than no deal?
Well, I fear that the members opposite have not made that logical leap yet, but I'm sure my honourable friend's question will have helped them reconsider in their own minds.
Extraordinary behaviour. Quite extraordinary behaviour. In you come, Rudd. It was good of you to drop in on us. Mr. Gavin Shuker.
Extremely grateful, Mr. Speaker. Can she name a single aspect or any moment in any aspect of the negotiations so far in which the government has gone head-to-head with the EU27 on an issue on which they have competing ideas about what to do and have come out on tops? Or is this yet another example of the government crumbling and facing up to the reality of leaving the EU?
We're making continuous progress in our negotiations with the EU. And of course, in any negotiation, there has to be give and take from both sides, and that is exactly what is happening. But it would be wrong to expose the details of those negotiations at this stage.
Mr. Philip Hollowbone.
In any divorce, the assets are divided. Given that in today's money, in real terms, our net contribution to the EU's over the whole lifetime of our membership amounts to £209 billion, will she make sure that we get our fair share of the EU's assets when we leave?
I can assure my honourable friend that that consideration is part of our discussions.
Daniel Zeichner.
Mr. Speaker, before making a big decision, it's generally sensible to inquire about the price. Yep. Most people will be absolutely staggered to learn that the average household in this country is going to be asked to stump up between £2,000 and £3,000 to pay for this. Yep. Now, could the government tell us what plans they have to tell people about this bill they're facing and ask them whether they think it's a good use of their money?
Yeah. Well, the honourable gentleman needs to look at both sides of the account, because we will not be paying ongoing vast sums into the EU that we are at the moment. So he needs to look at the big picture.
Order. Statement, the Secretary of State for Transport, Secretary Chris Grayling.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I'd like to make a statement to the House about our plans for Britain's railways. When, Mr. Speaker, those railways were privatised in the mid-1990s, it was against a backdrop of what many regarded as terminal decline. The radical beaching cuts of the 1960s had been followed by further line closures under British Rail, and passenger numbers had been falling steadily since the Second World War. Yet privatisation sparked a remarkable turnaround in the railway's fortunes. Over 1.5 million more trains are timetabled each year than 20 years ago. Passenger demand has more than doubled, and other countries are now adopting Great Britain's rail model in their own markets. To support this growth and to reverse decades of underinvestment in the infrastructure, we have embarked upon the biggest rail modernisation programme since the Victorian age. In addition to government funding, billions of pounds of investment from the private sector is helping to renew and expand train fleets, upgrade stations and transform services across the country. And franchises are making an increasing contribution to the public purse. So the rail renaissance we're seeing in Great Britain today is the direct result of a successful partnership between public and private sectors. Now, Mr. Speaker, this partnership has delivered real benefits for passengers for more than 20 years, but that success has created its own challenges. As the number of services has increased, our network has become more and more congested, making delivering the punctual, reliable services that passengers expect more challenging. On much of the network, our railway is operating on the edge of what it can cope with. It carries more passengers today than it did in the heyday of the 1920s on a network that is a fraction of the size. And when things go wrong, the impact can be widespread and quick, causing significant frustration for the travelling public. That is why last year I announced plans to start bringing together the operation of track and train on our railways. I said then it should be a process of evolution and not revolution, and I said that the exact approach may differ from area to area. But the outcome must be the same: a railway that is predominantly run by a joint local team of people with an absolute commitment to the smooth running of the timetable, whether planning essential repairs, responding to incidents on the line, or communicating with passengers. Today, I'm publishing more details about our plans, an update on what we're doing, and the steps we're taking to realise our ambitions. This publication, called Connecting People, A Strategic Vision for Rail, explains how we will create a new generation of regional rail operations with a relentless focus on the passengers, economies and communities they serve. It represents the biggest change to the delivery of rail services since privatisation. Now, although we've already achieved significant structural improvements, with joined-up working between operators and Network Rail, and Network Rail's own transformation into a series of regional route businesses, the document explains our plans to go much further. Where it will deliver real benefits for passengers, many future rail franchises will be run by a joint team, made up of staff from Network Rail and the train company, and headed by a new alliance director. This will make the railway more reliable for passengers by devolving powers to local routes and teams, and to ensure that actually one team is responsible for running the railways and the infrastructure they use. So today, Mr. Speaker, I'm issuing the invitation to tender for the next South Eastern franchise. This will, amongst other things, deliver longer trains, providing space for at least 40,000 additional passengers in the morning rush hour, and a simpler high-frequency turn-up-and-go timetable on suburban routes, which will boost capacity and provide a better service for passengers. And as part of that unification of track and train, Mr. Speaker, the day-to-day operations on the South Eastern network will be run by a joint team led by a new alliance director.